sort of done this, and okay, well, everyone knows where Japan is. This was just a map of introduction, so I'll move past this quickly. And just to say that, okay, Japan is now, well, 4 main islands, but during the Ice Age, so 20,000 years ago, this Japan was a little bit different in shape, but still separate from Korea in the west there. So yeah, so who are the Japanese? Yeah, okay, that's the end of end of part one. So I need to go next to part two. Presentation, no, part two. Okay. So yeah, so this is just the idea. Now, when we talk about the Japanese, then there are lots of different aspects of what it means to be Japanese, or human identity, human culture, if you like. So there's culture, there's class, ethnicity, race, gender, and so on. And it's not obviously not the case that the Japanese are all the same in terms of these different categories. So people have different ideas about each of these different things. And the sort of the modern idea of the Japanese, the Germans, is centers on the nation state. So you have a passport, an English passport, which I have, which is not really worth very much at the moment. But this idea, of course, is very modern, and it was really developed through things like newspapers, railways, schools, television, of course, and the classic sort of study about this, how pre-modern ethnic groups became nation states, is Anderson's Imagined Community, and there's a German translation of this, a very well-known book. So before 1868, most people in Japan didn't see themselves as Japanese. They had local identities. And I'll just skip over this thing. So so if we want to go, as in this class, we want to go back before 1868. So what do we do? And there are various other concepts which we might use. One is the old concept of race, which hang on. So it's now a very, of course, old-fashioned concept, but the idea that people in different, true that, to some, if you take, as I've done in this slide, representative examples of different people from across the world, they look a bit different. But they're still various, and this concept, of course, was popular in the 18th and 19th centuries, but it's not scientific, and it can't be supported on a genetic basis. And as I mentioned at the beginning, so the Ainu, as in this picture, were at first seen as being a sort of a white or Caucasoid race of people because they had sort of white skin. Okay, it's a black and white photo, so they look white, and they also have a lot of hair, body hair and facial hair, so they look quite European to the first visitors. But in fact, if you look at the genetic aspects, then you can't really support this concept of race at all. So these are very old maps now, but these are, well, for example, blood groups and various sort of genetic polymorphisms in Europe. So they follow these clinal arrangements. So they move gradually from one region to another, and these do not overlap. So if you look at hundreds of different types of genes, you often see different patterns. Okay, and in both of these maps, you can see a difference in the sense that there's a movement from east to west in different ways, but the diversity is still very strong. Okay, and genes are also influenced by the environment. And this is well, when I was a student, there was a lot of talk about earwax, and you might know that people in East Asia and in people in Europe have not everyone, but often have different types of earwax, either wet or dry. So a lot of Europeans have a wet earwax, and a lot of East Asians have dry earwax. And for this, you need different types of these. What do you call these? I forget what they call them, even in English, but um, to sort of clean your ears. And so this is the European Q-tip type, and this is the East Asian one. And but yeah, so it's and in Japan, there's an interesting distribution of this. So in the West, there is more dry people with the dry type. In the east of Japan, there's more people with the wet type. So this Klein gradual change suggests that in the past there might have been some immigration, and you also see the same sort of pattern with, for example, blood types, which different blood types, the A, B, O. There's more certain types are more common in the west of the country, and other types are more common in the east. But the question is, well, the question not today, but 10, 20, 30 years ago was, is this really genetic or does it reflect the environment? Because the west of Japan is much hotter than the east of Japan. And when I was a student, one of my advisors was in this picture, Robert Attenborough, who is the son of David Attenborough, the famous naturalist and TV presenter. And he said, well, okay, this is interesting, but is it genetic or environmental? At that time, we didn't know. But today, we know it's genetic, and we can take old bones, human bones, and we can extract this gene from the bone and say this person had wet earwax or dry earwax. So the technology is just incredible compared to what we were doing 30 years ago when I was a student. Another, well, at that time, using skulls. One was a metric, so measuring the size of the skulls. But the measurements were very much influenced by the environment, so the living conditions, the type of food, the type of the way that if you sit on the floor, sit in chairs, then this can affect. I mean, these are very small differences anyway. Another technique is this non-metric traits, and quite a few of these on our skulls, and usually they don't have any sort of environmental impact. So these 30 years ago, these were used quite a lot. But today, of course, we have all these wonderful new genetic technologies, so this is not really used very much at all. Okay, now I think that's the end of this one, so I'll just move to part 3. Yes, okay. So, and then what is culture? What is Japanese culture, for example? And I can see Chow there waiting, so I'm coming to the end of my time. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about culture. And if we talk about Japanese culture, we have some very sort of stereotypic ideas. and this is a slide I used to use in Japan with my students, and I would ask them before, "What is Japanese culture?" And some of them would say things like this. So, sushi, sleeping on the floor, geisha, going to hot springs, and then whoops, and then I would say, okay, so how many people eat sushi every day? And it was no one. How many people have been to a geisha place? And there was usually no one. Um, so these are certainly stereotypes. These are part of Japanese culture, but they're not necessarily so common. There are also yeah, other aspects of Japanese culture. These are more sort of minority aspects, if you like. So, um, Japanese businessmen drinking beer at night. There's sort of Lolita Gothic culture, young women, other young women's cultures. Um, it's not necessarily common, but it's part of Japanese culture, and certainly can be very different to Germany or Europe or China as well. Um, so we can think about culture, if you like, as a way we express um, a different concept. So this is an entrance to a Japanese house or building, and so you take off your shoes when you enter the house, and there's a very strict dividing line as to where you take off your shoes. And in Europe, well, I think a lot of people also take off their shoes when they enter the house, but it's not so precise or exact where you do that. And sometimes, if you're in a rush, you might just wear your shoes to pick up. If you've forgotten something, you might come back and pick up something. But a Japanese person would, well, 99% of the time would never do that. And so when I was in the Middle East, for example, it's also a custom to take off your shoes, but people from other sort of social classes would come into other people's houses, and because they thought they were very high class, they would not take off their shoes in the lower working class people's houses. Um, and the next slide. So yeah, similar example. So this is types of cooking, and well, every culture has these types of hot pot type of cooking, but it can be very well, very different, a little bit different depending on. So if this is a typical Japanese style. This is, I think, a Korean style. This is a probably French or cultures, but in fact, there's a lot of variation depending on class, depending on the region, and as to how they actually dress. This is another photograph which is taking a long time to upload. Yeah. So okay. So humans are very, of course, very intelligent, but this intelligent again is not. So it's something we have already. It's a genetic feature, but the precise, yeah. So um, so general intelligence, if you like, is genetic, but the specific way that we use intelligence is through culture. So this picture is of Inuit people in Canada who use their intelligence to live in a very difficult environment, a very cold environment, and they have this very clever, different and different types of animal fur. So often around the hood, wolf, the fur of the wolf is used, and then different, well, reindeer and things like that can be used for the main part. So it's very, very detailed. It's like a set of culture which is impossible to reinvent um, every year. So you can't suddenly say, in September, oh, it's starting to get cold. We have to think how to get through the winter. Um, you have to already have this, well, tradition. So the culture comes in a sort of package which you might think of as a tradition, and this is common of course, in human cultures. Um, and then cultures are not like billiard balls, so um, when they move around the billiard table, they change. So as one culture meets another culture, then um, the culture changes. So, for example, the sushi example, I just showed a picture of sushi, which of course is um, a well, traditional Japanese food. But today, salmon is often used in sushi, the fish salmon. But that's not at all traditional. That was, in fact, introduced by Norway, by the Norwegians I think, in the 1970s. And the Norwegians suddenly said, "Oh, this sushi dish is very nice, and we have a lot of salmon. Why don't you buy salmon from us? And we think it will be very good on this sushi." So until then, salmon was not used, or very rarely used in sushi. But now, of course, it's very, very common in both Japan and in Europe as well. And then the fifth point is that biology, language, and culture are, well, usually separate. I mean, there's some, of course, some overlaps, but generally speaking, they are separate things. And the first person who really emphasized this was Franz Boas, who was a German anthropologist. Well, he was born in Germany, but then he went to America, and he worked in with the Inuit in Canada. He worked in Canada in the northwest coast, and he and his, well, students really emphasized that this thing that biology, language, and culture are separate. So, for example, one of his students studied Japanese immigrants in Hawaii, and the student looked at the first generation immigrants who were born in Japan, came to Hawaii, and then the second generation, so the sons and daughters of the first generation, and of course the second generation were already speaking English, American, um, as a sort of, well, often as a first language, and the student also at the time measured the heads of the children, the first generation and the second generation, and found that the shape of the head was a little bit different. I mean, not we're not talking about aliens or something, but a little bit different, and this was not, it's not a genetic change. So these are the children of um, parents who are both born in Japan. So the difference in the head shape, if you like, is due to the environment. So it's sitting in chairs. I don't know. We don't really know the whole thing, but playing baseball. Well, Japanese like baseball as well, so maybe not. But eating American food and things like that. So it's a purely lifestyle type of difference. So this was at the time a very important. And yeah, so and today, of course, in some cases, this language and so forth can overlap. So this is a little map of the Slovene language today, and in to a great extent, it overlaps with the country of Slovenia, but there's still Slovene speakers in Austria and Italy. And of course, the language of Slovene is very similar to the language of Croatia, so people more or less can understand each other. And even within Slovene, there are such a small country, it's only 2 million people, the size of Shikoku in Japan, if that means anything to anyone who's been to Japan. So it's very small, but there's still also a lot of dialects within this language. Okay, so that's the end of.
Can you? Okay, then are you ready to start, Chow?
Yes.
So then the floor is yours.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. First, I would like to thank Martin for inviting me to give this talk, and it was my pleasure to give some introductions on the genetic perspective on the peopling of Japanese archipelago. So my name is Chao Ning. That is the Eurasia Triangle Group. You know that our group leader is Martin. I'm from the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History. No? Okay. So since most of you maybe come from a linguistic background, I would like to give some basic background about genetic studies. I'm a part of genetic study using ancient DNA to trace about human prehistory, where this population came from when it was mixed between different populations. So DNA is the substrate of genetic inheritance. This means that both each of us we have a set of unique DNA from both of our parents, and DNA was transcribed from into RNA, and then RNA was translated into proteins. It was proteins that used as organic functions, like we with different protein kinds that we were different from each other. Like I'm in yellow skin, you are in white skin, and the other people they have black skins. So all this kind of genetic ancestry will came from DNA. And the structure of DNA is actually double helix and composed of 4 different kinds of nucleic acid, A, T, C, G. And in genetic studies, we use some linear sequence of DNA reads. We named it as a reference sequence. Population genetics, we usually use one set of reference sequence. This means this reference is fixed, and we usually map or align our genomic sequences to this reference genome. Like we map individual one to this reference genomes, and we find it is identical to the reference genomes. And when we mapped individual 2 and individual 3 to this reference genomes, we find some nucleic acid differences between individual 1, 2, and 3. Individual 2 and 3 is actually identical to each other. They both carry the red C alleles, but individual 1 they have T. This kind of differences in genetics, we called it single nucleotide polymorphisms, and in short, we called it SNPs. And the other name, you'll find it in many other names like alleles, locus, marker. variant or mutations. It is because of these mutations that actually make us different from each other. And by using this kind of genetic data, we can distinguish who is who. So who is which genetic is which genome is from me and which genome is from you. Mutations is actually a strong powers for species evolution, like we adapt to a new environment. So when we move to a new environment, we tend to develop some unique SNPs, some unique mutations that is good for us to adapt to the new environment, and this actually make us different from each other. So actually, human mutation rate is very low. Per base pair per generations. But when considering that we have 3 million base pairs in our body, so it is estimated that we will inherit around 30 new mutations or variants from our parents. So how much do we differ from each other? It is known that identical twins, because they came from a single germline, so they are identical to each other. They have no differences. But sometimes we find some identical twins, they are not exactly the same looking. This is because the transcriptions from DNA to proteins, some genes are immune, some genes are silent. So this actually makes some small differences between the appearance of identical twins, but genetically there is no differences between them. And for unrelated humans like you and me, so we have 0.001 differences between each other. And for between human and champions, we have this difference is only about 0.01, and human and the source, this rate is increased to around 0.1. Since we, as I mentioned, since we have 3 billion DNA base pairs, this means that we have 3 million differences or 3 million SNPs between each pair of haploid human DNA sequences. This means that between me and Martin, between me and Hudson, so we have 3 million differences between each other. That's those mutations actually make us different from each other. Compared with other species, human diversity, human DNA diversity is actually very low. So it was lower than gorilla, champions. This is from my perspective. This is because human is more mobility, because a Japanese can marry with a European a Japanese man can marry with a European woman, girls, and people from East Asia, they can actually marry with Africans. But for for other species, it will be very hard for them to get this kind of mating because of the long distance. This actually close mating make the genetic diversity between humans are lower than the other species. Sorry. Since we are studying DNA, so where does DNA came from? So it was came from our cells. In each cell, we have 2 sets of DNA. So one set of nucleus DNA, and the other set is mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA has many copies in our cells. It has around 1,000 copies in each cell. And the nucleus DNA, we have 22 pairs of autosomal DNA. That is different from another set of sex chromosome DNA, which determines whether you are a male or a female. Like if we have sex chromosome like XX, then the mean this guy will be a female. And if we have sex chromosome pairs of X and Y, this means that this individual could be a male. So nowadays, autosomal DNA is the most frequent used tools in constructing human population ancestry, because we both inherited our genomes, our DNA from our parents. Like me, I have genetic autosomal DNA from my father. I have autosomal DNA from my mother, and my mother and my father is also in the same case. They have their ancestry from their parents. So in this case, from my side, in my body, I have ancestry DNA from my parents. I have ancestry DNA from my grandfather, my grandmother, and my great grandfather, and so on. So from the first generation, that we will have two ancestries, that is our father and my mother, our fathers. And the second generations, we actually have four ancestry component or proportions to be traced, that is from our great grandfathers. And to the third generations, though, we have eight ancestry that can be traced from our great grandfather, great grandmother. Then what about 30 generations ago? How much ancestral proportions that we have? It is 1 billion. So considering if we regard one generation as 20 years, so 30 generations is roughly 600 years ago. This means that if we use modern human DNA to trace human population ancestries, even around 600 years ago, we will have 1 million ancestry sources to trace. So this may makes a modern population DNA to trace human ancestry much harder, because there are too large amount of ancestry to trace. So that makes ancient DNA from different time transect to direct test human ancestry much more powerful tool in the population genetic studies. It has been a long dispute questions where modern human came from. Recent archaeological and genetic studies has shown that has proved that modern population were actually came from Africa. So at around 200,000 years ago, so a group or maybe several waves of populations starting migrated out of Africa. These populations at different time period, they migrated north and eastward into the Europe, and northward into like the Eurasia steppe, and eastward into the eastward to East Eurasians at some time point around 60,000 years before present. Well, for population dispersals in East Eurasia, there is a long dispute whether it was modern installations were from one layer of prehistoric population dispersal, or a two layer of prehistoric population human dispersal into this region. So recent cranial-metric analysis has shown that populations in East Eurasia follow a two-layer dispersal of prehistoric populations. With the first layer from Africa, they migrated along the sea line and eastward at some point around 60,000 years before present. And those initial populations were related to some Andamanese populations from the Andaman Island, the Australians. the Papuans and the German genomes from Japan. And the second layer is 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 somewhat a mystery because we don't have much data to support these migrations. So it is hypothesized that the second layer is related to unknown populations around 4,500 years before present. That is from from South Siberia, or from some region north of China. This is not sure. And this sort of populations actually partially replaced or maybe admixed with the first layer populations like Roman-like ancestry, like 40,000-year-old Tianyuan individuals from China. They were admixed with those populations to form modern populations in East Eurasia. Just this year, there is one German genome published in Human Biology that they possessed this German genome to a very basal clade that is ancestral to before the separation of East Asians. Northeast Asians and East Siberian populations. This means that this German genome is actually very basal. They were clustered with the Angay populations. This is a modern population that is genetically very basal to the East Eurasians, and it was on the same place with the Tianyuan individuals, which were dated around 40,000 years before present. So after German split from the ancestral East Eurasian populations, and then East Asians started to separate from the ancestral of Native American populations and the Northeast Asian East Siberians. And then at some point around 23,000 years before present, so the Northeast Asians East Siberians further separated from Native Americans. So this figure actually shows that German ancestry is among the first layer populations. It was very different from like recent populations. Genetically, it was different from recent populations from East Eurasians. In genetic studies, we usually plot principal component analysis with modern populations, as shown in these figures. By compare our ancient individuals or our target individuals with the other clusters of populations from the same region or from the nearby region from different time period, we were able to tell about the relative genetic relationship between those populations. Like what we will see in this East Asian PCA. The first PCA actually distinguish the North Siberian populations with the Japanese Ryukyu samples from the Ryukyu Island. And the second PC actually distinguish North Siberian populations and the Tibetans. What we can see is that the German genomes from across the Japanese archipelago forms a very tight cluster. This means that they were genetically very similar to each other. Actually, this means that these German genomes, although they were scattered, distributed in the Japanese archipelago, but they are genetically very similar to each other. This means that this genome may be isolated from other part of their continent for a very long time, and those genomes, those individuals are actually subject to some gene flow that makes them more similar to each other. And to the more recent time period, the later migrant Yayoi genomes. It was like it lies intermediate between modern Japanese, modern Ryukyus, and the local Jomon genomes, and this means that to the other end, we will see ancient Chinese genomes, and all these Yayoi genomes were intermediate between ancient Chinese genomes and Zhoumen genomes. This means that compared with Zhoumen genomes, Yayoi genomes actually shifted towards Chinese, ancient Chinese genomes. This means that maybe some genetic ancestry from ancient Chinese came and mixed with Zhoumen populations to form the Yayoi genomes. And with time went by, when we look into the modern Japanese populations and the modern Ryukyu individuals from Ryukyu Island, we will see they were more prone to ancient Chinese individuals. This means that this may tell us that continuous genetic contribution from ancient Chinese into Japanese archipelago actually make them more like ancient Chinese with time went by. And here comes the conclusions. So German individuals actually from various locations of Japan share similar genetic profile, suggesting their long-term isolation in East Asian island. And the incoming Yayoi farmers contain both German and Asian China ancestry, supporting the two-layer hypothesis. We also find continuous genetic admixture between Yayoi and mainland China to form modern Japanese genetic architecture. That's all.
Thank you very much, Charles. We're back. The peopling of Japan. That was what we tried to explain today. The little picture that you see there is actual picture from Mark's presentation that represents Hanihara's dual structure model for the formation of the Japanese people. And it actually expresses a bit the essence of what both Mark and Chao were trying to tell us today, namely that genetically the modern Japanese that are here, the Honjitsu Nihonjin, these people, the modern Japanese, they descend from Jomon people, the people of which Chao told us that they were present on Japan since 30,000 years ago. And these old inhabitants of Japan admixed with people coming in from China over Korea around 1000 BC. These people came in, they came to Japan, admixed with the Jomon, which means that they married and made children, and that resulted in the present day Japanese people. The mainland Japanese people are thus a kind of mix between these local Jomon people and the incoming Yayoi who came with farming from China over Korea to Japan. On the other hand, we also spoke in our courses about Ainu people, and we spoke about Ainu language, which is a completely different language, not related to Japanese. The Ainu people in the north go back to the Jomon people, but with much less admixture with these incoming farmers. And this is also true for the Ryukyuan people who live in the south of Japan on the Ryukyu Islands and who speak these Ryukyuan dialects and languages that are related to Japanese. They too go back to the Jomon people, but with less admixture from the modern Japanese. This basically means that when these Yayoi people came from Korea to Japan, they pushed the local genes, the Jomon genes, to the peripheries of Japan, to the Ainu in the north and the Ryukyus in the south. So that was the basic story of both Chao and Mark today. Unfortunately, it went a bit different due to technology. I apologize for that, but next time I will try to build on this and to bring this together with linguistics and integrate it with the genetic and archaeological findings from Mark and Chao. That was our schedule. I just wanted to say that there is a small change of schedule in the sense that today we had the peopling of Japan. Next week I will try to frame this inferences about the Japanese past, language, culture, and genes. But then on the 22nd of January, we originally already planned student presentations. But here I propose a general wrap up and also a session with some guidelines for the presentations. And then we will have sufficient time in the 3 next courses to go through all student presentations. That means that 2 of the presentations, that is by Mrs. Seibert, Daniela, and by Mrs. Edmondson, Charlene, I should say, because it's a late borrowing from French. These people will shift their presentations to 1 and 2 weeks later. And for all the other people, the dates will stay the same. I hope this does not cause any inconveniences for Daniela or Charlene. Are you okay with that, Daniela? And you too, Charlene, is that okay for you?
Yes, that's fine. Would that be on the 12th of February then, or
that would be
a
on
week later?
the 5th of February. So on the 29th,
okay.
on the 29th, we have Elias Appel, Ramon Böhme, and Daniela Seibert. And then on the 5th of January, which is my mom's birthday, we have Charlene Edmondson, Katharina Lumbeck, and Kevin Neidhoever. And then on the 12th of February, we would have Nadine Almeida and Julia Leidig.